I want to talk about the biggest and the most important story in the world, the Wuhan coronavirus. This coronavirus is a catastrophe on the scale of Chernobyl for China, but actually it's probably worse than Chernobyl, which was localized in its effect. The coronavirus could result in a global pandemic. While you were all sleeping overnight, the number of diagnosed cases in China increased by 30%. Now, let me be clear, that's not new cases, that is just newly admitted cases. It is probably several orders of magnitude higher than that. Also, while you were sleeping, China now has its entire border with Russia closed. 2,600 miles, Russia has closed that border. El Al has shut down travel between Israel and China. Air France has shut down travel between China and France. And that's in addition to all the other countries that have already shut down travel. From what we know so far, and there's still many unknowns, this virus could have both a long incubation period, as much as 14 days, and individuals could be contagious while asymptomatic, which was not the case with SARS in 2003. Furthermore, from some cases, it appears that the virus could be aerosolized, which means it doesn't require the kind of contact that you have with, say, a married couple kissing each other or a family living in close quarters in a hotel or apartment, but rather the distances we are all sitting apart right now. Yet China is still lying about all of this. They've been lying about it from the very beginning, and you don't need their history of lying about SARS in 2003, though it is relevant here. You just have to see what's happened over the last 2 months. We now know that the first case manifested no later than December 1, even though China didn't reveal it to the WHO until a month later on December 31st, when they continued to hide it from their own citizens. And they continued to say that it had been contained inside Wuhan. Today, it is in every single province in China. They also claimed for almost 2 months, until earlier this week, that it had originated in a seafood market in Wuhan, that locals had contracted it from animals in, say, bat soup or snake tartare. That is not the case. The Lancet published a study last weekend demonstrating that of the original 40 cases, 14 of them had no contact with the seafood market, including patient 0. As one epidemiologist said, that virus went into the seafood market before it came out of the seafood market. We still don't know where it originated. Could have been another seafood market. Could have been a farm. Could have been a food processing company. I would note that Wuhan also has China's only biosafety level 4 super laboratory that works with the world's most deadly pathogens, to include, yes, coronavirus. Now, look at China's own actions. They have quarantined 60 million people, 60 million, more than the entire population of our West Coast. They've shut down schools indefinitely. Classes canceled nationwide indefinitely. Hong Kong, a part of China, has basically shut down all travel from the mainland. That's why it is essential that we immediately stop all travel on commercial aircraft between China and the United States. Making exceptions, of course, for American citizens to come back, as we just brought back yesterday, allowing essential trade to flow as long as crews on ships and aircraft are not allowed to go into the general population in America, and making exceptions, of course, for medical personnel to go into China to try to get a handle on this. It is essential that we take those steps, and essential that we get to the bottom of China's deceit and incompetence on this measure. And gentlemen, I raise this with you because you're responsible in your combatant commands for some countries that have the most fragile public institutions, to include the most fragile public health institutions in the world. So I ask, even though as of this morning there are not yet confirmed cases of coronavirus in your combatant commands, though I suspect there will be soon, what is your assessment about the ability of the governments in your combatant commands to handle a potential global pandemic like this? General Townsend.
Thanks, Senator. So there are not, that I'm aware of, any confirmed cases, as you mentioned, but there are some suspected cases. The first report of suspected case I've heard of is in Djibouti, which you would imagine with a significant Chinese presence there. So the capacity of African nations to deal with this problem varies widely. For example, in Eastern Africa, Central East Africa, they've been dealing with Ebola, and they've been dealing with Ebola largely on their own and doing a pretty good job of it. So I think capacity there, but anywhere else in Africa is probably not to that degree.
Admiral Fowler.
The Venezuela crisis has already strained the social services of many of the nations. As you're aware, Senator, we had to deploy the hospital ship Comfort twice in 1 year to last deployment 12 different nations, and in one 5-day span it can do the equivalent of a whole month for a region of some of the major countries. So I would be extremely concerned. Like General Townsend, the capacities vary widely, but in many cases they're strained, and to the limit I'd be very concerned if we saw this spread.
Thank you. As a defensive measure, I just say again, it is essential that we shut down all commercial air travel immediately between the United States and China. As an offensive measure, because that probably won't stop it entirely, and because if it becomes a global pandemic, we have to deal with countries with very limited capabilities here. We need a Manhattan Project level effort to work with our best research scientists and laboratories in this country to develop a vaccine as quickly as possible.
Right. Well, that's a lot of questions. I guess we can take them one at a time. But if you just do a very simple Google search on does China have a BSL-4 laboratory, Wuhan comes up right away. It's at the top of the list. That's all. The moment this type of thing happened, I began to do that. And so a BSL-4 is the most serious type. And basically, BSL-4 labs, we have many of them here in the United States, are used to develop offensive biological warfare weapons with DNA genetic engineering. So it does seem to me that the Wuhan BSL-4 is the source of the coronavirus. Yes, and my guess is that they were researching SARS, and they weaponized it further by giving it gain of function properties, which means it could be more lethal. And indeed, the latest report now is its 15% fatality rate, which is more than SARS, and 83% infection rate. So typical gain of function, it travels in the air. So it could reach out maybe 6 feet or more from someone emitting a sneeze or a cough. Likewise, this is a specially designated WHO research lab. So the WHO is in on it, and they knew full well what was going on there. Yes, it's also been reported that Chinese scientists stole coronavirus materials from the Canadian lab at Winnipeg. Winnipeg is Canada's foremost center for research, developing, testing biological warfare weapons. It's along the lines of Fort Detrick here in the United States of America. And yeah, I have 3 degrees from Harvard. Would not surprise me if something was being stolen out of Harvard to turn over to China. I read that report. I don't know what was in those vials one way or the other. But the bottom line is, my opinion is, and I drafted the U.S. domestic implementing legislation for the Biological Weapons Convention that was approved unanimously by both houses of the United States Congress, signed into law by President Bush Sr., that it appears the coronavirus that we're dealing with here is an offensive biological warfare weapon that leaked out of that Wuhan BSL-4. I'm not saying it was done deliberately, but there have been previous reports of problems with that lab and things leaking out of it. And I'm afraid that is what we are dealing with today.
And so can you give us, I mean, we'll be talking about the Wuhan and the coronavirus in China, but can you give us kind of like a bigger context I know you've previously in interviews said that since 9/11, you think that the U.S. has spent $100 billion on biological warfare research. We know the Soviet Union, if I'm not mistaken, developed anthrax as a bioweapon. And you've also mentioned that UK, France, Israel, and China are all involved in biological warfare weapons research. So, and something interesting, I believe 1 or 2 years ago, a Bulgarian journalist and the Russian government shared their concern of the discovery of a U.S. bioweapons lab in Georgia, in the country of Georgia. You've commented how in Africa, U.S. has set up bioweapons labs to work on Ebola, which I think is illegal under international law, but they were allowed somehow to put those in Africa. So can you give us like a bigger picture, what's going on with these different countries and what's the purpose of this research?
All these BSL-4 labs are by, United States, Europe, Russia, China, Israel, are all there to research, develop, test biological warfare agents. There's really no legitimate scientific reason to have BSL-4 labs. And that figure I gave, 100 billion, that was about 2015, I believe. I had crunched the numbers and came up with that figure, the United States since 9/11. That, to give you an idea, that's as much in constant dollars as the U.S. spent to develop the Manhattan Project and the atom bomb. So it's clearly all weapons related. We have well over 13,000 alleged life scientists involved in research, development, testing biological weapons here in the United States. And actually, this goes back. It even precedes 9/11, 2001. I have another book, The Future of International Law and American Foreign Policy, tracing that all the way back to the Reagan administration under the influence of the neocons. And they got very heavily involved in research, development, testing of biological weapons with DNA genetic engineering. It was because of that that I issued my plea in 1985 at a congressional briefing sponsored by the Council for Responsible Genetics. I'm a lawyer for them. They're headquartered in Cambridge, Mass. All the MIT, Harvard people are involved in that, the principal ones. And then they asked me to draft that implementing legislation. So the implementing legislation that I drafted was originally designed to stop this type of work, death science work, I call it, by the United States government. And then after 9/11, 2001, it just completely accelerated. My current figure, that last figure, 100 billion, I haven't had a chance to recrunch the numbers because I just started classes, but you have to add in about another 5 billion per year. So basically, this is an offensive biological weapons race by the United States government, and it's been and with its assistance in Canada and Britain. And so other states of the world have responded accordingly, including Russia and China. They were going to set up a whole series of BSL-4 facilities as well. And Wuhan was the first, and it backfired on them.
So, I mean, would you basically consider what happened in Wuhan just boil it down to ineptitude or incompetence on the Chinese part?
Well, it's criminality. It does appear they stole something there from Winnipeg. This activity that they engaged in clearly violates the Biological Weapons Convention. Research, development of biological weapons these days is an international crime. I mean, the use of it would be. And that was criminal. I'm not saying they, deliberately inflicted this on their own people, but it leaked out of there. And all these BSL-4 facilities leak. I mean, everyone knows that who studies this. So this was a catastrophe waiting to happen, and unfortunately, it happened. And the Chinese government under Xi and his comrades there have been covering this up from the get-go. The first reported case was December 1. So they've been sitting on this until they couldn't anymore. And everything they're telling you is a lie. It's propaganda. The WHO still refuses to declare a global health emergency. Its head, Tedros, was over there shaking hands with Xi and smiling and yucking it up. The WHO is in on it. They've approved many of these BSL-4 labs. They know exactly what's going on. And that is a WHO research-approved laboratory. So they know what's going on, too. So you can't really believe anything the WHO is telling you about this. Either they're up to their eyeballs in it, in my opinion. You can't trust anything the WHO says because they're all bought and paid for by big pharma. And they work in cahoots with the CDC, which is the United States government. They work in cahoots with Fort Detrick. So you can't trust anything. However, the swine flu, and yes, I agree, pharma made a lot of money, but that swine flu, which I looked at, it did seem to me to be a genetically modified biological warfare weapon. It was a chimera of 3 different types of genetic strains that someone put it together in a cocktail. Fortunately, it was not as lethal as all of us feared. So fine. But as I said, this figure I just gave to you was Saturday from Lancet, which is a medical publication, saying it's a 15% fatality rate and an 83% infection rate. So it's quite serious. I think far more serious than swine flu. As for Big Pharma, sure, they're all trying to profit off this today as we speak. There was a big article yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, all Big Pharma trying to, peddle whatever they can over there in China, even if it's worthless and won't help. We do know that if you read the mainstream news media, they say there isn't a vaccine. Well, there is. It's the by the Purebright Institute in Britain. That's tied into their biological warfare program over there. They were behind the hoof and mouth disease outbreak over there that wiped out their cattle herd, and it leaked out of there. So it was clear they're working on a hoof and mouth biological warfare weapon. But the vaccine is there. I have the patent for it here. I haven't had a chance to read the patent. It's about 25 pages long, and my class has just resumed. So eventually I get some free time, I'll read the patent. But you can't patent a vaccine with the United States Patent Office, unless the science is there. So there is a vaccine. Everyone's lying about that. No one's pointing this out. There's a vaccine, but instead, Big Pharma wants to make money, and the researchers say, well, it'll take 3 months, and we're racing for it. Everyone's going to make a buck off of this, that's for sure. But there is a vaccine. What they're telling, I have the patent here. I have not. It's been patented by the United States government. So obviously, I don't know exactly how workable it is, but it's a vaccine. I don't know why is it out there now. Why isn't someone saying there is a vaccine? Perhaps political leaders have already been vaccinated, for all I know. I really don't know, but there is a vaccine. Purebright is well known there in Britain, and it's tied into Fort Detrick, and CDC is tied into Fort Detrick too. So they all know there's a patented vaccine. For sure, that's the only reason they developed these biological weapons is eventually to be used. Sure, I mean it's like the Manhattan Project. We put all that money into developing an atom bomb, and even though it was not needed to end World War II, they still nuked Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So yes, I think that's correct. And also, these can be used covertly. Anytime you see a unexplained sudden outbreak of a disease like this anywhere in the world, both for human beings or animals, I always suspect the biowarfare agent is at work, and I monitor the situation like I did at Wuhan until I can reach a conclusion. So, yes, they can be used. And as for the United States government today, they are fully prepared, armed, equipped, supplied to wage biological warfare with anthrax. These other more exotic things, I don't know, but they have the weapons. They're stockpiled, and we have to understand. If you read Seymour Martin Hersh's book, published about 1968, he won the Pulitzer Prize for Me Lie. He had the whole offensive U.S. biological warfare industry in there back before it was illegal, okay, and criminal. And basically, after 9/11, 2001, that entire industry, offensive biological warfare industry, has been reconstituted here in the United States with all these BSL-4, BSL-3 labs, well over 13,000 alleged scientists, sort of like Dr. Mengele, working on these things. And so other countries have responded in kind, like Russia, like China. Yes. France is involved. Britain's involved. Sure.